Hi everybody. It's been so long that I've done a video that I will not lie, it's a little bit nerve-wracking. But here we go. I have said for a while that I wanted to do a more in-depth video on neuroplasticity. I've been juggling so many things. But before I do that, I want to lead into that with a video on trauma, because that is such a big part of healing. The reason I do not get particularly hung up on the word itself is the word has been loaded in many different ways. So a lot of people in society have been conditioned to think of trauma as those big catastrophic events, which are absolutely trauma. Assault, war, death, violence. And then we got into this definition over time of big T's and small t's, which I'm not a huge fan of, defining the severity of the trauma, because in reality, we're learning more and more the trauma, the nature of the trauma isn't as important as how the individual perceives it, how it affects their nervous system, how it's stored in the body. And, so we have a lot of people who think that they've never experienced a trauma. And then we have people that know all of their traumas, but don't know where to go from there. And in reality, as human beings, we have all experienced a form of trauma. Some of us have experienced very large catastrophic events, and some of us have, less typical traumas in our mind when we're younger, and remember that trauma is also on the societal level. Systemic oppression and racism does cause trauma. Medical trauma, when we've been through a lot of medical procedures, poverty, there's so many levels of trauma, but on the individual level, when we are talking about childhood, where a common place for trauma to be born is really comes down to, I apologize, Daisy's barking, a child not getting their needs met, even if it wasn't deliberately, and no human is perfect. But as a child, when they're not getting their needs met by their caregiver, even if, again, it's just more their caregiver isn't attuned to their needs, that kicks off a survival mechanism, right? And it's not safe. And a lot of times we carry these beliefs from that experience, even if it's so stored away back in that subconscious of, I'm not good enough, or I'm not lovable, or I'm not worthy. And this can happen. It can be the smallest events, anything that really produces shame. There's a lot of people who feel their childhood was perfect. And then when you really, really dig, there are some beliefs being carried, whether it was even at school and a trauma there. And the big thing is to recognize, trauma is both it affects the cognitive level and the body level. And sometimes it actually, before it arrives to the conscious mind, is stored in the body primarily and in that nervous system, causing some dysregulated nervous system symptoms. The biggest thing is, a lot of people do know all of their traumas, but they don't really know where to go from there. So I'm always big into, okay, what are we going to do with that? And I know from my own healing journey, I used to think there was, some holy grail of trauma therapy. And, over time, I've come to realize there are so many ways to integrate trauma, and there's wonderful therapies out there, but there isn't one set way of this is better or this is the way to do it. And I used to think I'd have to be in a specific form of trauma therapy to process trauma. One of the big things to recognize, is working with the limiting beliefs that have come up, and recognizing how those patterns get acted out in life. We tend to act them out in relationships, or we tend to draw on very similar situations. And that story gets activated. So, one is becoming aware of those limiting beliefs. One is working on the physiological level. I'm a big believer in that. So even with breath work, regulating that nervous system more and more when you go into a trauma response, we can assume we're in a trauma response when our reaction is incredibly disproportionate. That's the word trigger. When our reaction is incredibly disproportional to the situation, or all of a sudden we're flooded with these stress chemicals and we're angry, or we're in fight or flight, right? I need to leave this relationship, or, I'm going to be abandoned. That's very common, right? Or, just incredible anger at this person in front of you, even if the actual thing they did is rather trivial, right? Or incredible grief, or when that shame kicks in, I did something bad, I'm not good enough. When we are able to recognize this is my old beliefs operating, meaning I'm in a trauma response, and we can interrupt it with breath work, re-regulating in that moment, taking ourselves out of it if we can, and with that observation and recognizing what I say is it's very real, but it's also, before we have recognition, we might be in a trauma response. We buy into it that it's literally about that current event versus being aware we're actually reliving something from the past. This is where a lot of people that think they're not stressed are carrying a lot of unconscious stress and not realizing that some of the things that they are triggered by or the beliefs and the way they're operating when they see the world are stemming from, unresolved issues. I normally just say issues from childhood, but unresolved traumas. And it is not that we necessarily have to go excavate every trauma. And I wasn't trained that way. I have not found that super helpful on my personal journey. Some people do. But, trusting that the body and mind bring up things in their own time. And there are some things that we will probably never remember. But again, it's just working with the way it's being acted out now, catching our beliefs, catching our reactions, catching our triggers. On the physiological, just besides just breath work, meditation is wonderful to kind of rewire that brain a bit. Movement therapy, yoga is wonderful, just putting yourselves into positions that create relaxation responses. There are different body works out there that can help process trauma. And integrating ourselves, and that's a big one. That is the other piece, is a lot of us will split. And I'm not talking about the pathological splits that we talk about in the DSM-5. I'm talking about more, all of us have these sort of different parts of ourselves. A part of us wants to do something, a part of us is scared, or, a part of us feels this way about the situation, but a part of us feels a different way. And that is very, very typical, because to get through a trauma, we tend to disassociate a bit, especially when we're young. And so, it's so important that we start to integrate ourselves and recognize that every part of ourselves is valid. When we're having a response, that's normally a different part of us. Well, somebody will be like, I don't understand why I reacted that way. That's because some part of us isn't healed. And a lot of times we exile that part and want nothing to do with it because we don't like the way we react when we feel that way. But that actually leads us to sort of this lack of integration, and we're kind of operating all over the place. So it's starting to recognize each part of ourselves is completely valid, is worthy, figuring out what the needs of that part is. And, a lot of that term is self-parenting, learning how to show up for ourselves is a big one, right? And especially if these developmental trauma, a child didn't have the capability to have like an adult show up for them if their caregiver wasn't doing it. As an adult, our journey is to be that adult that we didn't have in some way. And again, that's no criticism on a parent. That is just sometimes a parent isn't attuned exactly to their child in that moment. And so it's learning for how we can show up as the adults to ourselves, as we can learn to be parents to ourselves, how, we can be that support to ourselves. And that's tough when we get thrown into those parts without awareness. And as we start to have that awareness, when we're activated, when we're triggered, we can start to reconcile in a different way and to show up as that adult self, really taking care of ourselves, finding out things that make us feel good, finding ways to find joy, comfort ourselves, soothe ourselves, and not have that be dependent on somebody else. So this could go on and on and on, but I really wanted to just give a brief overview. And this is a huge piece of unconscious stress. So I challenge you guys to think about what are some things that trigger you, what are times that your reactions are disproportionate, and can you start to interrupt that with some breathing, observing yourself, challenging your limiting beliefs. And that's a good homework start. All right, let me know if you guys want more of this, and hopefully we'll jump into neuroplasticity. See you soon.